Okay. And you're pretty well set up there. You got a nice mic, so sound should be good.
Awesome. Do I
Well,
sound good?
yeah, you sound good. Well,
Awesome.
I just was skimming over the rather lengthy email that you sent me, and it was a lovely email, so I really appreciate that. But not everybody gets to read that, and so if we share this, we'll have to see. But why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself, Michael?
Sure. I don't know how much detail I can go into completely from the email, but to summarize, I grew up as a Christian in the Pentecostal church, Assembly of God. Grew up in Southern California, and then moved out to the East Coast when I was in high school. And I would say I had a real faith of sorts, but at the same time, I was my very nature was very skeptical. I think I told you this in the email. I can very vivid experience being like 5 or 6 years old and asking God to let me fly as like a test to see if he was real. And even things like, whether Santa Claus is real and things like that. I can remember at a very young age, having this kind of idea that things that are too good to be true are, too good to be true. And, but I always had kind of this, a faith of sorts, just because, specifically my dad, he was just such a good person and somebody I had a lot of confidence in. And so I always felt like there's something, he was in touch with something that was real. But at some point later in life, just some things happened in my family that I won't go into too much detail in, but that kind of skepticism reasserted itself. And once I realized my faith was built on something other than my own kind of account or worldview. It was kind of built on my attachment to somebody else's. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And once I lost that, it was pretty disorienting, to have that kind of fall apart. But at the same time, even though I had a kind of a skepticism towards my faith and that kind of fell apart, I never really had I never really found the materialist view of the world that persuasive either. Mm-hmm. It just, something about it didn't click. Like it was obvious to me. And I actually read a lot of kind of the new atheist books and evangelical, like the Lee Strobels and Josh McDowell's and things like that, because I knew I had to figure something out for myself. And I always had this awareness reading all those works that everybody has an axe to grind. Like they're coming at this not like it's not like an open-minded investigation of facts. It's like, whether it's the new atheist or others, there's all kinds of jumping across points of what they hold up as evidence didn't seem like evidence to me. So I kind of was in this long period where I really kind of had a default kind of, I still had a sense that there was something in the Christian story that was right and correct, but I wasn't going to church, wasn't, living a life that was recognizable as Christian by anybody around me. And that was kind of my experience for, I don't know, a good long while. I mean, I'd say about better part of 10 years or so. Kind of the shift for me was a very odd time in my life where I just had a lot of things kind of collapse at once in a single year. Had a breakup with a longtime girlfriend. I had, I unexpectedly got laid off from my job, and it was just like this whole kind of crescendo of things in a very short time frame. And one of the things I found during that time frame, I found myself at odd points, just being overcome with emotion. And I've never been like a very emotional person. I would say most people would probably say I'm I'm a little flat in the, you know, I'm not, I don't, I've got a good poker face most of the time. I don't give away a lot emotionally. And I found myself like oddly just overcome with emotion all the time. And, I took it to be just kind of, okay, well, you just had a rough year and, maybe you're not that in touch with your emotions. And, this is just kind of some weird side effect and consequence of that. And, so I kind of ignored it for a pretty long time. And I'm not sure exactly what woke me up to one day, but I can remember I have like an Evernote, like I scrawl lots of notes to myself all the time. And so I know the actual day when I did this, I just decided I should pay attention to this. And funny enough, what came to mind when I was doing that too, I think I wrote this in the email as well, that, David Foster Wallace is his famous thing that humans worship, like everybody worships. It's like, you don't have a choice. Like it's something kind of fundamental to whatever we are as humans, that's built in. And if you don't consciously choose whatever it is you worship, something else kind of asserts itself there.
Yep.
On its own. You just imbibe something from the air or the culture around you, it goes there.
Yep.
And I realized when I started looking underpinning this emotion, it was usually I'd start crying, and that it wasn't really. I expected that I was gonna, I don't know, find something like, oh, like I'm sad about something with losing my job or breakup, but it wasn't that at all. It was more this, like a sense of more gratitude, and a sense that in the middle of all this pain I was experiencing, there was something really good coming out of it. And so that sense was really weird to me, because I don't think I had a belief. I certainly didn't have a strong sort of Christian belief, but I still had this kind of sense that there's got to be something out there that I don't know, because again, I didn't think anybody from a materialist scientific perspective pieced things together in a way that was convincing. So I was just kind of like open to some idea of something, but it was really clear to me that this idea at some fundamental level was an idea of redemption, of like things at their worst somehow being turned topsy-turvy back into like becoming something good. And it was like I was very aware and grateful that this thing that was negative was really working itself out in a positive way. And I didn't have any rational or reasonable reason to make that association, but it felt very real and vivid, and that it was like what I was just overcome with a sense of beauty, of like that in the worst possible scenarios, like something equally as good could be like this. I had this kind of conception visually of like just this dark area that, like a flower emerges and just like suddenly everything around it is immediately transformed. Like there's this, like, I don't know, just this immediate reversal at the kind of the lowest. And so anyway, I just had this kind of idea floating in my background of my mind. And it was about a month or two later, I just started dating another girl who was, she kind of had a similar background to me in terms of like, she had issues with her past and her family. And she was wanting me to go to church with her. And I think I had gone to a church with her a few times, and we went on a double date with another couple. And I just remember just really liking the couple. Like I just like immediately, I'm just being really attracted to them in a fundamental way. And the guy, I just was like, man, I want to be this guy's friend. Like, which is very strange to me. And he grew up Jewish, and actually he'd become saved by just listening on the radio to this guy, Mark Rutland, who is the president of the college where I went to school. I actually went to a Pentecostal Bible college for school, and that's how I'd become saved. And so I just found it odd that I had this thought. I remember walking away being like, I don't think I've ever had that thought before upon meeting somebody. I want to be their friend. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't, but like, I think it was maybe a couple weeks or a month later, he was in a tragic accident. He he was actually celebrating his engagement and ended up being paralyzed. It was like just a freak accident, like hit a sandbar in the ocean and was paralyzed from the neck down.
Oh my goodness.
And yeah, it was just unbelievable. And I remember I had maybe hung out with him maybe once or twice before that. And he came back and I knew he was in the hospital, and I just had this sense like, well, I really do want to be this guy's friend, and he's a captive audience, And
yeah, he could probably use one now.
Exactly. So I started just going to visit him at the hospital, and just had a lot of opportunities to just kind of share where I was at. It was kind of talking about where I was at, in terms of these kind of ideas whirling around me in terms of where I was at. Like it started going to church, but I was like really didn't know what I believed, and somewhere in the middle of all that, I just remember having this really clear idea of that God loved this guy. And I was actually thinking about this today. I was like, it's hard because again, I'm a very skeptical person. So as soon as I start having a strong emotion, I'm like, oh, what's the source of this? What self-motivation do I have for this? Uh-huh. But it was something I couldn't get away from. And I felt like I ended up actually telling him, like, I just feel like I'm supposed to tell you this. Huh. And it was hard to tell somebody that, in a position like that too, like where, they'd obviously had this horrible thing happen. It's like, and I don't have any framework or reference for, how this is true, but it was undeniably true to me. And that kind of, I don't know, that's just kind of laid the groundwork, I think, for getting me back to a place where I, started going to church, and taking this more seriously. I ended up going to, when he got out of the hospital, I started going to a small group with him. And then so it was probably about, I don't know, 6 months or a year later that Jordan Peterson, that I discovered him, and through him discovered you. And that kind of, I hadn't really thought through any of those things intellectually. I was having all these emotional experiences, like of some sort of reality. But that kind of gave another like intellectual oomph to fitting it all together, in terms of from that side of things as well. So that kind of cemented it for me, because I think to that point I was kind of just like how I feel today. It dictated my level of faith, but that there was something in Peterson, especially that it made me realize that the part of me that I thought was smart and cynical also had its own, it had something to gain with its nihilism, which was kind of this, as soon as you believe the nihilism, now you're off the hook, if it doesn't matter, then hey, I can't be held responsible for what I do. It was a get out of jail free card of sorts. And he really cemented that home to me powerfully, where I realized I had to look in the mirror like, wow, that's a big motivating factor. I can't look at this as like me being tough and smart and honest with myself when I come away with this nihilism. There's something else that I'm getting in as well from it. And that kind of pushed me down that path to really dismantles that to a large degree. And then when I found you, it wasn't just the dismantling of the nihilism. It was something else from an intellectual perspective that replaced it, like, and really lined up with kind of these or like imagistic or emotional ideas I had about redemption that were lined up with a lot of the things that you were saying that kind of, I don't know, gave it more structure, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, I really wanted to thank you for one of the reasons I want to talk to you, just because I feel like it's just played a fundamental role in terms of like being something solid. I mean, I don't know how many hours you've put in online, but like, I mean, I've probably watched at least 90% of it, and it's been something that has really, I don't know, transformed my thinking in a lot of ways, and given me a way of digesting so many things, and just a way of accountability, like the consistency that you display in terms of your intellectual approach and just your honesty and just the way you interact with people. It's, I don't know, it's been hugely beneficial to me. So I just want to say thank you.
Well, well, I appreciate that. I've put in a lot of hours, but for me, most of it has been process for me too. You know, we talk through and work out our faith and fear and trembling. And I like the way you told your story. I mean, you have these, even if you're not the guy whose feelings are necessarily right there on your shirt sleeve, they're down there, and you have to work them through and work them out. And I, the David Foster Wallace point, I think is a very good one. And what a shame he's, he took his life and he's no longer around to share himself with us. It's a robbery of the world.
Yeah.
But that's no, you've got a beautiful story. So where has that led you now?
It's tough to say. I don't know. I feel like I get drawn into really abstract and philosophical and theological areas with all this stuff. And, I don't know, I try to just be consistent about going to church and like being involved in my small group. And, but I still
feel like friendship with that individual. How's he doing?
He's doing well. I actually was just talking to him before I talked to you, and he was excited to hear that we were going to talk.
Good. What a huge life transition, though. I assume he's not. He's a younger man. I mean, he's
about the same age as I am. Yeah.
Okay. Wow. He's married.
Yeah, and he got engaged beforehand, and yeah. So like
she went through with it.
Yeah, it's
powerful.
Yeah, that like it's had an impact on, I'm sure, like on so many people, myself included.
Yeah. Because when you enter a relationship, knowing there's a lot of loss that the couple will suffer in something like that. So, wow, that's just powerful stuff when people walk that road together.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that's always been helpful to me in watching you, is I feel like you don't really shy away from the pain and suffering that's in the world. I think that's and not still holding on to a Christian perspective within it.
It's go ahead.
I think it's difficult. It's it's so many times in church. It's just within the framework of a short sermon. It's hard to encompass the complexity that comes with that pain and suffering, and the what we preach of the gospel.
It's Tim Keller has this great way of saying it that I haven't write it down and memorize it where I find it, because I've heard him say it a couple times. It's lodged in my head, but it's basically the point that, people often throw away their faith in the face of suffering. But when you think about that, what are they exchanging? It's just kind of, okay, I can't believe because of the suffering, getting rid of it. Okay, so what do you got instead? And it kind of connects up with that David Foster Wallace point that they've thrown away faith. They've thrown away the idea, okay, God, they're angry. Okay, so they're reacting. So God isn't real, or God isn't good. And so react. And so, okay. And you see this actually in relationships, where if you watch someone who has someone for whom anger has become a part of their personality, has become their go-to response, they wind up throwing a lot of things away that might in the long run have actually helped them, because that's what anger does. And so people then do that with their faith, and it's like, so what takes its place? Nihilism? And I love the way you phrased, I've got a new pattern now with these conversations where I take notes, because I forget, and then I don't know what to title it or do anything when I got to post it a couple of weeks later. But I'm really enjoying the note taking. But when you made the observation that you were getting something from nihilism, and that's really good, and that's a really fine observation, because there is this weird emotional satisfaction that we get from it. And I think that emotional satisfaction is from I think we feel like we now have a sense of mastery. We might be like Scar in The Lion King, being the king over a kingdom of devastation, but at least we're king, Well,
at least we get the joke.
Yeah. And hey, if the house is going to be burned down, at least I burned down the house. It's like, okay, but the house is burned down. And at some point, and I think that road, I love Kierkegaard's image in Despair Unto Death, where the person decides enough with it, and so they kill themselves, only to realize that physical death didn't end their self. And the sudden horror of realizing I can't stop this thing that I hate, which is myself, or the pain that has so bonded to myself. I mean, these are just such powerful things, and people get trapped in them, and sometimes so completely not of their own fault. Mental illness, you watch someone who's grappling with depression or bipolar, or you watch someone in there, and it's horrible.
And I think it's interesting to see too the anger that the atheists have for God that doesn't exist. There's something there that it's like I thought about it this way, that there's a sense in which there's a function that for ultimate justice to be there has to be this thing, this God. And there's an idea that I think the atheist has, that he's abdicated that role, and that they're the ones that have figured it out, and that they're the ones that are going to cast the first stone, and they're almost like they can't wait for God to come and try and haul them into a court, because they're like, I'm going to accuse you when that day comes, and it's so strange that this kind of anger and self-righteousness for something that doesn't exist by their own claim.
Well, proper anger is a proper response to injustice. And, there is some truth to the angry nihilist or atheist who looks at the universe and says, there's injustice here and it shouldn't be. And what's so interesting is that they instinctively know, and this is kind of my ontological argument that gets conjoined to the moral argument, that there should be a judge. It isn't right that Stalin got away with it, or that Hitler got away with it, or that Mao got away with it. And or that, on a personal level for someone, maybe someone had a horrible parent that, that this person who had wronged them got away with it, and that shouldn't be right. And of course, in a Christian context, well, they won't. And then you begin to think, well, okay, but how exactly can justice be served in the age to come? And we have to then say, well, we don't know. And it's probably true that none of us would be able to actually bring justice in a case like that. And all of our courts are these sort of ways that we can imagine, through which we can imagine that kind of divine justice. And so they reflect it. They're kind of a derivative form of that divine justice. And so when real justice happens in courts, it connects up with that. But if you have no God, finally Mao got away with it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's both deeply disturbing and also tempting in all the wrong ways.
Yeah.
And so even from that point of view, you could begin to see why this entire story of Christianity is good for people and civilization. Even if you say, well, I don't think there's anything to it. Yeah, but the cost of not believing it, that's a real problem. And you say, well, I can't just believe it because it's good for me. Yeah, that's a real problem too. So this is all important stuff.
Yeah. One of the things I wanted to ask you about is your Calvinism as it relates to free will. Where do you stand in terms of what your thoughts are on free will?
Well, I don't really like the term free will. I more like real agency. I think because none of our wills are free. We're formed. We're within a culture. We're deeply embedded. We do have agency, and that agency is real, and that agency is accountable. I think Calvinism is sort of a compatibilism. They want it both ways. And I think that the heart of the matter is that we don't have a clear idea how divine agency and human agency actually line up. And part of that is because of, again, part of it is because of, what I call God number one, in terms of the God who is immanent, the God who is built in. I got into a tiny little squabble on Sunday with a celebrity atheist on Twitter. And, because he was using kind of Peter Boghossian's idea of what faith is, which I think just doesn't make any sense. But, when you think about something like, if you'd ask an American, do you believe in Uncle Sam? And they'd say, well, I say, you pay taxes to Uncle Sam, but you're not saying that Uncle Sam is a guy in Washington, D.C. No, I'm not. That's not exactly what Uncle Sam is. But Uncle Sam is very real. And Uncle Sam, in fact, does things. And Uncle Sam, in fact, my agency and Uncle Sam's agency, if I travel overseas and I'm an American in whatever cultural context, and I express the Uncle Sam that is in me, the agency between me and Uncle Sam is sort of complicated, because certainly I do not disappear. In some perspectives, people might see Uncle Sam through me, but if the more they get to know me, the higher the resolution, they would begin to see me and Uncle Sam. But that's now God number one. But even with that purview, not to mention God as transcendent and active and choosing, But even with that purview, you can begin to see that this question of human agency and divine agency is enormously complex. You know, what's interesting about your story is, I've made this point a number of times, Pentecostalism, I don't think, is really a theological tradition as much as it is a cultural protest to modernity. Because Pentecostalism, in a sense, says it sees modernity and the lines that modernity draws and just says, no, because God's going to be active in my life. God's going to speak through us in terms of speaking in tongues. Yeah. God's going to give words of wisdom and prophecy and the whole 9 yards. And that's part of the reason that Pentecostalism all around the world, especially in the developing world, in places where modernity isn't quite so strong, it's just natural because, but we identify it as Pentecostalism, but it's not really a theological tradition. It's much more of a cultural movement that says no to modernity. So, you know, Calvinism, it's so funny because Calvin essentially was a second generation reformer who took a lot of what Luther had done and some of the other. Luther gets all the press because he's Martin Luther and he moved first and he didn't get killed and all of that. But there are a lot of reformers who are taking things. And so John Calvin took a lot of this stuff and kind of synthesized it, put it in his institutes, put it in his commentaries. You know, that stuff then kind of got promoted out through the Genevan Bible. And the thing Calvin is known for is it's really double predestination, which I'm not going to go into that right now, but his ideas of divine election were basically the same ideas as the Roman Catholic Church and the Lutheran Church. Those and so it was later in the 16th century or in the 17th century that in the canons of Dort and the Synod of Dort that some of this other Calvinism kind of took place, kind of got worked in there. So even though, you know, I certainly subscribe to the canons of Dort, which are a doctrinal statement of my denomination, I don't know that expresses the heart of Calvinism. And so often these Calvinist ideas, these Calvinist conversations just get locked in a lot of 17th century disputes with Arminianism. And I don't find it a terribly fruitful conversation because I don't think we have a good idea of how God works, how God's agency and our agency really connect.
I agree.
And I think part of that is I love Joseph's little speech at the end of Genesis. You know, it says to his brothers, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And it's like, okay, God meant beating up, planning the death of, and then selling your brother into slavery for good. So complicated stuff.
Yeah. Have you, how far, I know you've talked about Owen Barfield. How far have you gone down the rabbit hole with him?
Not far enough.
Okay.
So there's a Vervaeke video that is not in his series, an interview that he did with someone which is a really nice, it's a 2-hour video, covers a lot of his stuff, but he goes into talking about, you know, how reading changed in the 12th century. And I heard that and I thought, because there definitely is something. And I just talked to a Filipino couple guys in front of you who is a member of Opus Dei, which is an interesting sub-movement within Roman Catholicism. But, you know, he was talking about how he kind of looked at the sacraments and said, well, I think that the Roman Catholics and the Orthodox have a view of the sacrament that is closest to the ancient church. And I think that's probably true. The difficulty that we have is that our concepts of language have continued to move. So when we say things like, well, transubstantiation, that the sacrament changes into the body and blood, well, I don't know that those words mean the same thing today as they did 1,500 years ago.
Yeah, that's one of the points Owen is making. I'm reading like 2 or 3 books associated with him right now. And one of his ideas is that you can look at the histories of words in as a kind of means of exploring the consciousness of men that existed far back in time, especially in older words. And one of his ideas is that that a lot of these words he uses off the example of pneuma. I know you brought that up, where that for men in a different time that those words weren't like they were both and like they had both meanings together, the inner and the outer together,
right.
And that you could piece them apart somewhat, but that was more of a later phenomena that we have today of the kind of the division of those things. And that another thing that him and I'm reading another book called it's called The Great War. It's about it's about the argument that C.S. Lewis and
is there a book
Barfield,
about the Great War?
Yeah.
Oh.
And one of the big things that they had as a point of contention was Owen Barfield had this idea that that the imagination was a faculty for discerning truth. Whereas C.S. Lewis believed, that it's something you had to make a sort of factual statement for it to be truthful or untruthful. Whereas, in Barfield's view, those statements in them of themselves could never be truth. They could have some relationship to truth, but his idea of truth was more of more like the process itself of knowing, which is kind of an interesting thing. And it kind of intersects with another idea I wanted to talk to you about, which is, I guess this idea about I have that I'm kind of obsessed with, and I keep finding everywhere, is this idea of like the humility of God. And along with that is a question about what does it cost God to create and redeem? And that there might be some deeper sense to that. Like I think, some of if you look at, say, a lot of our ideas about God being like this kind of unchanging thing that doesn't feel pain and is kind of, it's like a Greek philosophical concept, that God that is completely removed from all this. That doesn't seem accurate to me. Like when you read the Bible, and they kind of like toss away a lot of the stories as the Bible is just metaphors, but it seems really clear that God changes his mind when people do things, that there's this real involvement that we have in the story where we are interacting with the divine, that something changes in response to us, that he's moved when he sees some action in the heart of man that changes, And I always think of that verse where it's like he's searching the whole earth for, hearts that are, dedicated to him to show himself strong on their behalf. There's something like there's desire there. So, and then, I don't think if God is really unchanging, there could even be desire. Like that doesn't make sense, and it couldn't, there's all, verses of God grieving. Yeah. And then I think even in the creation story itself, you have this process that God goes through, and then he rests at the end. And you could say, well, did he rest just as a symbolic act so that we could rest later and, in observance of the Sabbath? Or did he really expend himself in some full and complete way that the proper response to that was some sort of rest? You can see him like, at each interval of these epochs or whatever you want to think of them, days, if we think about the scientific perspective, it had to be a long time, but it's some process where he comes back and says, this is good. Mm-hmm. What does it mean for like a God as infinite as what we believe in, is what we see in the universe, to like expend himself to the point and like look back and say, okay, this is good. Yeah. Moving along, like there's like a real process of work there. Yeah. And something that is ongoing. And so that seems to align more with Owen Barfield's idea of some sort of process that's ongoing, rather than like God is a truth that's set in stone. That so it seems like there's this cost that God's playing, and also I think in terms of the cross, you could think of the cross as a one-off, but Jesus says that he comes to earth to show the Father, and so does Jesus bear the weight of all this pain and suffering himself, or is God also partaking in that in some way, And you could think of like a parent's relationship to their child in the ways in which the parent can experience the pain and suffering of that child and deeper and more fulfill, like across many intervals of time that the child can't even see, like bad decisions they've made and other things, where the parent feels the pain even deeper because they have more experience and faculties to experience that pain in a more deep way, whereas the kid doesn't even see what's going on. And I think God has to experience our bad choices and all the pain and suffering in the world in a deeper way because he has more capacity to do so, and he's closer to all the facts. Yeah. But I think he also experiences some of the joys in a deeper way than we have access to as well.
Yeah.
But I mean, it just, I don't know. It seems like it's theologically something that people don't really dive into because it's kind of muddy. But like one of the things that I find interesting too is this idea that, Paul talks about of us, the union of heaven and earth is also eventually a union between God and man, because, he uses that, the language of a body and a head, and then, a man and a wife, and the two become one flesh. And it's a great mystery of which he can't find the language to speak of. So he leaves it as a mystery. And then, so what is that union, first of all? And what does that union cost God? Like, what does he have to lay down in his infinite glory to be united to something finite? That's something that we don't think about much, but I don't know. It seems very clear to me that has to be happening. That God is, in a moment by moment basis, that he's working something out. And that, when Jesus says, I'm going to go prepare a place for you, that's not like he's going up in heaven and just like counting, like, just sleeping until some time clock, goes, all right, it's over.
Ring. It's time to wake up and, get the horse.
Yeah. It's
the white one. Get the white one.
It seems obvious something has to be going on.
Well, that is the image in Scripture of, the God who is emotionally involved, and the God who gets frustrated. And I love in, the desert wanderings, God and Moses, almost like a married couple, switch back and forth at who's more upset at the children and wants them dead, and the other one's like, no, don't. You can't kill the kids. You gotta keep them around. But I'm tired of them. Yeah, but if you waste them here in the desert, then all the other nations will hear, you couldn't keep your family together. So back and forth they go, and that's that's the image, that's the revelation of God. And again, it's and to me it always gets to the idea that God is more so, that God is, is God joyful? Yeah, way more than we can imagine. Does God feel pain and sorrow? Yeah, way more than we can imagine. Does God get angry? Yeah, way more than we can imagine. Is God merciful? Yeah, way more than we can imagine. And we have difficulty with that, because I was just reading G.K. Chesterton's Orthodoxy, chapter 3, I was reading chapter 3 today, but I read chapter 2 last night. And Chesterton has this great, in that chapter, it's a great illustration of a madman, where he says, basically the madman, his cycle is too small. It's, it's a circle, and so it's infinite, but it's too small. The madman can't get away from himself. And you just have this picture then, if you think of, and he says the sane person, actually their circle is a lot bigger, which is interesting. And then, of course, you'd think that, well, the God circle is infinitely large.
Yeah.
So whereas all the circles are, in a sense, infinite because they all go around, there's no beginning and no end. God's is large, and that then leads to the idea of God is more humble than we could imagine. Well, what would entail in that humility? Well, it would mean that he does not have to keep pointing to himself. He can give good gifts and just let the children enjoy them, and even the rebellious children. And one of my favorite parts of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus talks about the perfection of God, and then when I found that when people hear that, they usually think about that in terms of moral accomplishment, but actually the perfection of God is situated in the passage where it talks about God's generosity to the just and the unjust alike. And then that's when Jesus says, be perfect like your heavenly Father is perfect. And in his generosity to the just and unjust alike. And it's like that takes enormous humility. And so it's an astounding thing. I've also been reading. Will Durant was a couple, actually. Will and his wife wrote histories, huge volumes of history at the beginning of the 20th century. He's got a little book on the story of philosophy, which is a really a fun little book in terms of if you want to learn some philosophy. It's dated, but he just tells. And he makes the point about Aristotle, exactly what you made. If you look at Aristotle's God, this isn't the kind of God you're going to relate to. Why bother praying? The God of Abraham, goes to God and says, hey, is it right that you sweep away the just with the unjust? And God's like, God isn't the kind of God that says, who are you to talk to me like that? God says, oh, what's your point, Abraham? Well, what if there's 50 righteous people in Sodom? Will you take it then? No, I'll spare it for 50. And you watch them bargain, and you just think about, this is astounding. But here it is, and that God is, the God of Job and the God of the Bible. And you think, well, that's pretty amazing. So,
yeah. Stranger than we could have come up with.
Yeah, it certainly is. Stranger than we would dare come up with. I think that's true.
Your mention of G.K. Chesterton made me think of one of my favorite quotes by him, which he said, gratitude is happiness doubled by wonder.
Oh, that's good.
That one's always kind of hit me between the eyes. I remember hearing it for the first time. It was like on Thanksgiving, and it came on NPR. Of all places. And it's just stuck with me. And one of the things I think, I was thinking about the other day, like what Jordan Peterson has kind of brought to what he's done that's interesting and unique. I think that's one of the things he's kind of brought is those two things of gratitude and wonder. And it's kind of incumbent in or enclosed in his ideas of maps of meaning is, this idea that the world, we're not seeing the world as it really is, that your conceptions of the world are not the world itself. And so in kind of hammering that home, he's also saying, hey, but there's a lot more behind it that you don't see and that you could, if you wanted to, go explore.
Yeah.
And so I think, that especially the reason that has such an appeal, I think, to the male is like, it's like, there's all this uncharted territory. There are all these, like we live in a time where, the whole earth is mapped down to the last millimeter with, GPS coordinates. And he's coming along and saying, but there's actually these frontiers that are just outside of those, just dig beneath that map. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that you could discover. And that's kind of what if you listen to his lecture, I think that's what's interesting about what he's always doing. He's always amazed by these little tidbits of information he's presenting. Like he's found the most amazing thing. It seems a lot of this stuff seems so trivial, but he's like, no, this is really important. Just stay with me. And he kind of, I think he's demonstrating that that sense of wonder could be a part of much more of our lives if we were aware. what's really in front of us.
That's very true. No, I think you're right, and I think he has evoked that in a lot of people. I think it's part of his appeal. Well, we just have a couple more minutes, Michael. I don't know if there's anything that was on your list that you wanted to make sure you got in.
No, but I would like to ask you, I'm curious, how is this whole thing that you've gone through, this journey, how's it changed you? I mean, this is like, so many hours that you must have been like put into this process. And like, I'm just curious, like what it's been like for you and what's come out of it.
Well, part of I've always been a lifelong learner. And so part of, in terms of the time budget that this comes out of, is my learning. And this has been a deeply fruitful learning experience for me, partly just because there've been a lot of new conversation partners. And you can learn things from books, but you can also learn things from people who ask challenging questions back at you. So learning has been a big part of this. You know, the big surprise for this for me was a lot of the attention, and then the requests for content and conversation. And again, as a pastor, well, that's sort of my job in terms of people want to talk to me. Well, I should talk to them, and it's ministry. So obviously it's expanded the circle of my ministry, and my local church has been very generous in sharing me like they have. So, I hope it doesn't, I hope it doesn't change me too much. It's certainly given me some new opportunities, but I'm leery of the kind of influence that, it seems almost ridiculous to use these words, but fame and fortune can have on a person.
Sure.
That's a very dangerous thing, because you then begin to, you have to please the crowd. And pastors know this, because this is always something that's built into being a pastor. You have to please your local church, who are your bosses and the ones paying you. But technically, you're not really, God is your boss, not them.
Yep.
So there's always this tension. And if that gets magnified in terms of larger audiences, then suddenly you stop telling the truth about things. You stop being honest. When Peterson had his little, even just saying it now, if we share this, it'll bring a lot of comments. But even Peterson's tweet about the Kavanaugh business, part of that certainly was, a certain part of his following felt betrayed in that. And I don't think it was a particularly, I don't think he thought through that tweet. And Twitter is a device that's prone to temptation. But once you have an audience, and once that audience it's kind of like feeding the bear. The dangerous thing isn't really feeding the bear. The dangerous thing is stop feeding the bear. That's when things get dangerous. The bear's happy if you keep giving him what he wants. You stop feeding the bear, you got a bear to deal with. So, yeah. And I think about that. And fortunately, I wrestle with, do I want this thing to grow a lot? It's, over the last number of months especially, it's kind of had a nice, fairly slow growth rate, which has been manageable. But I like doing these conversations. I think they're healthy for me, because you're a real person. You're not someone else who is playing a status game.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't, if we post it, you'll see yourself on YouTube and you'll get some comments and all of that. And maybe you want to start your own YouTube channel, but you're a real person. And the problem is that the higher you get in a status game, the less
People that are real.
People that are real around you.
Yeah.
And then suddenly this game starts making its own weather, and you're doing things, and you just get disconnected from the massive lives and the incredible diversity of people's lives. And what's so gratifying about conversations like this is, your story is unique. I mean, it sounds trite and, it sounds, but your story is unique, and it's a worthwhile thing sharing. And to the degree that, I've got 11,000 YouTube subscribers, and probably 1,000 or 2,000 people will watch this video over the next few weeks, I think it's a good thing that others get to see and hear your story, because there'll be pieces of it that they'll be able to pick up and say, that's helpful for me. And so to be
it's certainly been the case with watching. I think that's one of the things that's been so helpful, is just seeing there's something about the idiosyncrasies of people's lives, the unique aspect that you mentioned that you can't fake. And so if you're searching for truth, when you see certain things in other people's lives, they just gleam at you with this kind of thing that can't be faked. That's something real happened there.
Yeah.
That's unique to that person, and it can't be, you can't wave it away.
Yeah.
Like you can, like a philosophical argument.
Yeah. So that to me, I'm so humbled and gratified by this. And how long will it go on? I have no idea. These things, life has seasons, things come and go. If I had 1 million subscribers, can Jordan Peterson do this? No, not really, because he would have to have some sort of filtering mechanism. And then the filter itself would then be that which is presented. If you shine a light through a screen, you get the shadow of the screen. It might be hard to see, but it's there. And so what's beautiful about this, it's a sample because of the people watching my videos, but it's a lovely thing. And so I'm just gratified by it, and feel happy that this is what's going on now. How long will it go on? I have no idea, but thank God for today.
One of the things you mentioned, I don't know, do you have to go right this second, or are you about to hit
I got a minute. You're okay. Last in the day. Pretty soon people are going to figure out ways to game even my little system. They're already starting. I'm watching that, but go ahead.
But you've mentioned in the past that an interest in kind of exploring maybe more formal ways of like doing some education and things with your channel. And I don't know, it's always occurred to me that you could implement something like Jordan Peterson's online university in like a much more like badly done way, but just using YouTube, in terms of like, here's I'm going to throw out some content here, and your assignment is to go, make a Google Doc that, summarizes this and kind of, and then comment on everybody else's, or make your own video and comment on people's videos, and just act as like, so that your time isn't, taken up too much, but other people are kind of acting as that feedback mechanism within the community itself. And really all you're doing is providing a locus or a center for them to have the conversation around, but they're kind of providing all the feedback to each other. And then maybe you bubble up some of the best bits of that activity, you just as a highlight here or there, but really the system's kind of self-sustaining in a certain sense by the community having these conversations with one another. It's just something that I've thought,
I think it's a cool idea.
Yeah.
I think that the challenge that I face is I'm at this point, I'm putting about as much time into this as I dare.
Yeah.
And it's always in competition with obviously my local ministry, which when someone there still is a hierarchy. And when someone from my church calls, I answer. And, I will usually, I will probably bump, YouTube callers by prioritizing church callers. And I think that's the way the hierarchy should be. I've
But
got,
I think if you were to do that, I think within your community, there's enough people that probably would volunteer to take on, some of the structure bearing elements of that extra requirement.
yeah,
Perhaps.
I think so. I've so there's an education thing that I was doing for a while, and I'm still doing sort of. It's called Sierra Leadership Network, where I do once a month. I'll do a chat with about 2-hour chat with about 6 or 8 people online, and I'll go through theology and some of that. And I earlier days I'd run that program with assignments and all kinds of things, and it was a good program. And now actually, obviously, with the bigger circle, I could probably do more, but I'd have to figure out. So I would have to cut something, and probably
Yeah.
what would get cut would be conversations like these. And so
Yeah.
it's already, because as so I'm going to have a conversation this week with a guy who has another channel dedicated to Jung. I'm probably going to have a conversation with Ron Dart this week. I want to do some denominational things. I've got so many ideas in my head of what I'd love to do that, and then I think, okay, well, who knows, maybe someday I'll do this more time than I'm doing now. But if I did that, I wouldn't also be pastoring as much, and that would
Right.
also impact me. And so it's all these trade-offs in terms of time and energy. So but it's a great idea. It's a great idea.
Yeah, I think for it to work, it would have to be decentralized. It could not be,
Yeah.
again, like most of the work of it would have to be kind of spread across the community. And I
Yeah.
know coming up with ways to do that effectively is kind of challenging,
Yeah.
but I think it's something that you could do badly, and it still have some value coming. There'd be something worth learning coming out of that.
No, I think so too. I think it's a great idea. So what do you do for work?
I work in the tech space, so I actually work in sales,
Okay.
which is, my background's more technical, but I work in for a cybersecurity company that, and I'm like what's known as a sales engineer. So I'm in the pre-sales activity, but I'm more, trying to help do things like proof of concepts and evaluations and, demonstrations of how the product works and those sorts of things.
Okay. So but many of the people tech artists, math people, math students. I had a lot of math students. It's very interesting, but obviously long form YouTube, people who can have the time in their life to do this. So
yeah. And it's weird because I use Zoom every day for work to get on a sales call. So it's funny. Now I'm on it for just talking to you. It's so strange.
Well, Michael, this has been a lot of fun, and I certainly I'm certainly grateful that you shared your story like this. And if we post it, I think others will be blessed by it. And but this has been lovely, and I love that you're looking at Owen Barfield. Interesting guy. That's part of it too. There's so many books I want to read now, and it's like it's all time is this horrible thing, and I'm a pretty efficient guy. I really do try to squeeze as much out of a lot of time as I can without getting tyrannical, but
I think that's what's so helpful to me too about your channel is that you compress quite a bit in terms of like what you've already digested, and so it's really helpful. But then there's certain areas that kind of gleam out of those compressions where like I want to go really dig into that and expand it out. It's so helpful that that you do that, and it's brought me down all these different paths. And I'd say I probably watch you more than anybody else just because you pull from so many different areas and you pull them all together into like a kind of, and you're trying to pull them all into a unified whole, which is really ambitious, and it's fun to watch because it's not easy. to
Probably
make
overly ambitious.
yeah. Yeah. But that's kind of, I think a lot of the people that you attract have that kind of same idealism to try and like, I know this is impossible, but theoretically it would be possible, you know.
And it'd be really cool if we, you know, the more we can do it, it's really cool because you want, and that's what I think about the age to come. I think of conversations where you get these people together and, you know, it might be fun listening to C.S. Lewis, you know, reading an account of C.S. Lewis and Owen Barfield's Great War, but you have to imagine that in glory, the war continues. and you know, they don't have the kind of time constraints we have, I would imagine. And so that's just an incredible, for me, that's an incredibly, that brings, that joy wells up when I imagine the possibilities of what that looks like. And when I feel that joy, the kind of unbelief that says, you know, oh, death is when there's nothing. And I think, oh, that's if that's the truth,
Yeah.
that's so utterly sad compared to what I can imagine could be so much better. Mm-hmm. So, and that's just my little head imagining. So anyway, well, Michael, this has been great.
Yeah.
And I will send you a copy of this video and we can decide what to do with it.
Perfect. Good. Thanks again for your time. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Thanks, Michael. This has been a delight.
Take care.
Bye-bye.